The state of contemporary Ukrainian studies, therefore Ukrainian politics, international relations in Canada, the country I know for a long period of time, since 2001. The main thing to understand is that Ukrainian studies, this kind of word or this term that we use, has not really changed since 1991 when Ukraine became an independent state. And that's because of the people running Ukrainian studies in Canada. Ukrainian studies in the Soviet era was maybe understandably dealing with issues such as culture, language, and history. Canada has produced the most new books on Ukrainian history in the Western world. Just think of Orest Subtelny and Pol Magocsi from Toronto, for example. Plus also Serhy Yekelchyk from out west, and David Marples and others, and Zenon Kohut. So in terms of histories of Ukraine and anything to do with Ukrainian history, there's no competition really from Canada. The new boy on the block is Serhii Plokhii at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. He's very productive, but remember that he spent his formative years in University of Alberta. And prior to that, his predecessor, Roman Špoрлюk, was very lazy, didn't produce any books on Ukraine throughout his time as the chair of Ukrainian history. So Canada is lead in that, but basically the fact that the USSR disintegrated, Ukraine became an independent state, did not lead to a change in mentality of the directors of various Ukrainian studies programs in Canada as to the need to broaden Ukrainian studies to include politics, international relations, economics, and those kind of areas. It remained the same, basically. In the case of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, a major portion of the last 25 years of Ukrainian independence, CIUS was headed by Zenon Kohut, who admitted that he did to me at a conference at Edmonton on the 40th anniversary of CIUS recently, that there was never any attempt to try and broaden that concept of what is Ukrainian studies. Now, of course, this has become into a crisis in some ways today, because you have this massive explosion of interest in Ukraine since 2014. You have huge numbers of people writing about Ukraine who don't know the country, who don't know Ukrainian language and therefore don't use Ukrainian sources. Many of them don't even know Russian and use only Western or secondary sources. But they all want to write about Ukraine, about this crisis, about this war from a variety of angles. And this is so at a time when Canada was leading in terms of Ukrainian studies in the field of history, it's now fallen behind because of this big explosion of so-called Ukrainian experts. Majority of them are not, but there has been this big explosion, the biggest explosion of writing on Ukraine since 1991 has taken place in the last 3 years. Not surprisingly, Euromaidan, Crimea, Russian-Ukrainian war, and just the general activities of Vladimir Putin vis-a-vis Europe and the US and Canada. One surprise in the 1990s is that we assume that the Ukrainian community in Canada is the most powerful, most influential in terms of relations with the government in the Western world. This is one of the myths, and I think it is a myth. I think that was the case in the past, up until maybe the 1990s or 1980s at the very least. But to give an example, the Ukrainian community in Great Britain has zero influence with the British government, really has no influence at all. This is an English-speaking country where there are no Ukrainian academic centers created. And this is a product of the fact that the dominant political party in Britain that I grew up with is OUN-B, Stepan Bandera organization, and they everywhere in the Western world have not been interested in supporting academic studies, America, Canada, and Britain. So they were the dominant group in Britain, and they did not have an interest in putting or mobilizing resources for academia in Britain. All they were interested in was putting up a statue to Volodymyr the Great or a monument to the Holodomor, nothing else. And at the same time, the British government in the mid-1990s created 30 new academic posts, which it provided funding for, 4 of which were on contemporary Ukraine. Why was that not the case in Canada? Canada, where the community was the most powerful in terms of its reach to the government, Ukrainian Studies did not lobby the Canadian government. Academics in Canada involved in Ukrainian Studies did not lobby the Canadian government. Cook did not lobby the Canadian government in the 90s to do this. In Britain, the British government, off its own bat, created 30 new academic positions in what it called areas which were not previously covered by communist or Soviet studies, and that included Ukraine. So today in Britain, we have more centers or more professors dealing with contemporary Ukraine than we have in Canada, even though the community is completely weak in Great Britain. And that includes Katerina Volchuk, University of Birmingham, where I did my PhD. We have Andrew Wilson, who's very active at the University College London. And we have Gwendolyn Sass, who used to be at London School of Economics, and Sarah Birch at the University of Essex. So we have, that has led to Britain being very active in the production of articles, books, think tank papers on contemporary Ukraine, far more than in Canada. And that was something that the British government supported, for obviously geopolitical reasons. In Canada, what has changed since 1991 is that a new chair of Ukrainian Studies was created in Ottawa, University of Ottawa. It's not very well funded chair. This is not a chair that would be very expensive to buy compared to, say, University of Toronto or Harvard. And it doesn't have many resources, and that's obviously evident in the very weak number of activities it undertakes. Its primary seminar is called the Danyliw Seminar because the Danyliw Foundation supports it, and it's held in sort of early November each year, late October, early November, and it's a 2-day seminar on contemporary Ukraine. That's its primary contribution to Ukrainian studies. The chair is headed by Dominique Arel. There was a scandal surrounding the selection process because the Department of Political Science at the University of Ottawa demanded that the candidates for the post of the chair of Ukrainian Studies be French speakers. Well, there were only 2 French speakers who were experts on contemporary Ukraine, one of which was Dominique Arel. So in multicultural Canada, French nationalism does sometimes trump that tolerance and diversity. The Dominique Arel, though, is an ivory tower academic. He doesn't reach out, doesn't do blogs, doesn't do social media, doesn't reach out to newspapers and to do commentaries and this kind of. He's not a public intellectual. So therefore, you won't see anything published by him since 2014, which is incredible, on the crisis, on the Ukrainian-Russian war. It's also he's very selective in who he allows to speak at the Danyliw Seminar. I tried on 4 occasions to be a speaker and was turned down. He certainly kind of controls who goes in there, and it's certainly not people maybe with my particular views. University of Ottawa, let's remember, has some rather bizarre academics who are very pro-Putin, and one who is simply off the wall, Ivan Kachanovsky, who continues to spread this disinformation around the internet about allegedly Pravy Sektor, Ukrainian nationalists, shooting the protesters on the Maidan. Something that comes directly out of Putin's propaganda is based at the University of Ottawa, something that Ukrainians half-heartedly complained about, but Cook basically continued to ignore. People like Oksana Bashuk Hepburn has been very active here, but she hasn't had the backing of the Cook establishment. There used to be a very active academic working on contemporary Ukraine at the University of Waterloo, Iván Yaворський, but I haven't heard from him for a long time. He was very active writing on issues such as the Crimea, Tatars in the Crimea and such like, but he has not been writing. I haven't seen anything published by him for a very long time, and I mean over 10 years or so. So I don't know why that's the case. Lucan Way, colleague of mine, is in charge of the Jacyk Program on Ukraine at the Munk Centre, Canada's premier kind of, shall we say, think tank academic centre in Canada. What's ironic about Lucan is that he follows in the tradition of Americans coming up to Canada to teach Canadians about Ukraine. And here I'm talking about Zenon Kohut, Frank Sisson, Pol Magocsi, and Orest Subtelny, 4 Americans who came up and took positions in Canada way, way back. He is a very bright guy. His stuff is always interesting to read, but sadly, he's a comparativist, what we call that in political science. You know, he'll compare Ukraine to Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Peru, and other places in the world. I mean, he's not somebody who will focus purely on Ukrainian politics, and he has not been active in writing about Ukraine since 2014. So, you know, he's been put in charge. He's taken over what Peter Solomon used to do, Professor Solomon. He's been put in charge of the Jacyk Program, but he's not really a Ukrainianist interested primarily in Ukrainian politics or post-communist politics. For him, that's part of a broader comparative field that he deals with. The one problem that you have with Lucan and Dominique Arel is that they both hold the same position, which I think is not a very fruitful position, and that is that the conflict in Ukraine is a civil war. They both peddle this view. I think it's a wrong view, and it's a view which kind of it's a product. Well, in the case of Dominique Arel, it's a product of his Quebec background because he's always been interested in language questions. In the 1990s, Dominique Arel was very active in promoting the idea that there are 2 large communities in Ukraine, Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, and they were always on opposing sides during election campaigns. I think his views have been proven to be wrong in this current crisis where Russian speakers have been shown to be patriotic Ukrainians. And the idea of a civil war feeds into this view held by kind of people on the right in American academia who are realists and people on the far left at the University of Ottawa and elsewhere, that this is somehow nothing to do really with Russia being involved. This is an internal conflict between Ukraine and Russian speakers. How else do you understand the civil war as not that between different groups of linguistic speakers, which is completely wrong in understanding what's going on in Ukraine. So I would disagree that it's a civil war, and sadly, the 2 prominent experts on Ukrainian politics in Canada, Lucan Way, Dominique Arel, believe this viewpoint. So who's left? Ironically, the 2 most prolific writers on contemporary Ukraine in Canada are 2, not only are they both Brits, but they're also Yorkshiremen. So this is our personal contribution from Yorkshire to develop Ukrainian politics and the study of Ukrainian politics in Canada. David Marples and myself. David Marples, although a historian, he's a historian of the contemporary world, so the 20th century history, and he's just published a book which is available free for download on PDF, in a PDF format, which brings together all of his writings that he's done since 2014 on the crisis, on Euromaidan, and such like. He also jointly edited the book on the Euromaidan as well. So David Marples, unlike Lucan Way and Dominique Arel, has been extremely active and in writing and in publishing since 2014, even though he's not a political scientist, he's a historian. I would say, though, besides this problematical area of the weakness of the study of contemporary Ukraine in Canada, the other problem areas are really that Canada's quite weak in terms of media issues. The Ukrainian community has not really promoted or lobbied for younger members of its community to go into the journalistic profession and therefore to go into newspapers like National Post, Globe and Mail, and elsewhere. And ironically, in Kiev since 1991, there's never been a Canadian newspaper or magazine represented. There have been American, British, and others, but to this day, there's never been a single Canadian newspaper represented in Kiev. Why is that? Why cannot the Ukrainian community help to fund a journalist who works in some ways, maybe only part-time, to plant articles and commentaries in Globe and Mail, National Post, and elsewhere? Let that person be based in Kiev. That has not been the case. And therefore, there are very few, you can count them literally on the one hand. In Canada, I know of only David Marples, Oksana Bashuk Hepburn, and myself who write on Ukrainian politics. Nobody else. That is incredible for such a huge community in Canada. That's partly a product, of course, of the inward-looking nature, the provincialism of those who control Ukrainian media products, particularly television news products. During the period from the Euromaidan to the end of 2015, I undertook 300 interviews on for newspapers and for electronic media, TV, radio, and elsewhere, throughout the world. During that period of time, I was never once invited by a single Ukrainian TV channel in Toronto to be interviewed. Why was the entire world interested in the views of Taras Kuzio, but not Ukrainian television channels in Toronto? Makes you wonder. Maybe they just want to interview swoi, their own kind, as it were. What also differentiates Canada from the US and Britain is that the Canadian government does not really reach out to experts. This is very prominently done in Washington, D.C., where people kind of, it's a rotating door between think tanks, academic centers, and the US government. They go on secondment to work in the National Security Council or elsewhere in the US government. Like myself, I'm invited to give talks to the US government. That doesn't happen in Canada. That's something, again, that Cook could lobby for greater interaction with the Canadian government. But for Cook to do that, Cook itself would have to be interested in reaching out to experts in Canada. And Cook has never reached out to Lucan Way, Professor Magocsi, Taras Kuzio. Cook is itself, like Ukrainian TV channels in Canada, disinterested in the views of prominent experts. Again, it wants to sort of work only with swoi, with its own people. What kind of solutions can we talk about? Well, it's more difficult now than it has been in the past because funding is lower than it used to be. Many of that older generation that was very good in providing donations for Ukrainian academic and community activities has passed away, sadly. So that's certainly a problem. But there certainly needs to be a reconfiguration of the priorities of key academic institutions like CIUS away from its pet projects. And these pet projects are things like Cossack history, translations of Mikhailo Hrushevsky into English, or especially the Holodomor. I honestly do not understand why the Ukrainian diaspora is still involved in Holodomor projects 25 years after Ukraine became an independent state. Surely that is something that should be done now in an independent Ukraine, and it has been done since 1991. If you go to any bookstore in Ukraine, the place is chock full of books and collections of documents on the Holodomor. There's no excuse to have something in the West which ties up money and funding that could go elsewhere when that kind of research could be done and publication could be done in Ukraine. I understood the need, and Canada was in the lead of promoting the study of the Holodomor back in 1983 on the 50th anniversary. The documentary film Harvest of Despair and elsewhere, and that was very, very active from 83 through to the late 80s. But today, 20, 25 plus years on, I think there's a time for those limited funds to be used for something else. And that certainly could be contemporary Ukraine. To me, it seems that the new director, whoever he or she is, who comes in to head the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, could do no better than to look to the Toronto office of CIUS, where at the moment you have 4 people close to retirement or past retirement, who certainly could be could be changed, maybe if they go into earlier retirement. But the Toronto office of CIUS would be the ideal place for CIUS to have a hub, a center for the study of contemporary Ukraine. Let, Prairie, the study of Ukrainians in Canada, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture and language could be focused at Edmonton, the University of Alberta, and the study of contemporary Ukraine could be at the CIUS office. It's a very small office at the based on the University of Toronto campus. That shouldn't be difficult if the people were changed there, if they had new blood who weren't really obstacles to that. I mean, I've personally experienced that kind of disinterest in that office as it stands currently. Although my office, my academic center, is supposed to be the CIUS Toronto office, I was never given any resources there. And the CIUS Toronto office never once organized a single presentation in my entire 4-year research program, which obviously shows a complete disinterest in my research and in disinterest in contemporary Ukrainian politics, incredibly at a time of a Russian-Ukrainian war and during a time when I was traveling frequently to the front line. Zero interest on the part of the office. That needs to be changed, I think. If the CIUS wants to become this new body, a new revitalized body, then the Toronto office would be the ideal place to create this kind of ferment and interest with people coming in from Ukraine as well to study contemporary Ukraine. And obviously down the road, there will be also a new chair of Ukrainian Studies who will replace Professor Magocsi. He's not expressed an interest in retiring yet. He's still very active in publishing, as usual. But certainly one would hope that the new chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto would be somebody who would have a more balanced approach to covering both history and politics, especially because Professor Magocsi's position is a joint position at the Departments of History and Department of Political Science. So it's ideally based for that. If that was to happen at both the chair and the CIUS office in Toronto, then you would have a very new and strong and powerful presence for the study of contemporary Ukraine at Toronto. And that would be the premier place for it to happen in Canada, especially because the Munk Centre is located there, and Canada is Canada's business centre and Canada's media centre as well. So potentially there is a possibility for an improved situation, but currently Canada has, at the time when Canada led the way in the study of the history of Ukraine, it's fallen way, way back in the study of Ukrainian politics. That could change, but it's all down to the need for concrete steps to be undertaken. Thank you.